My brother laughed during dinner. It wasn't a gentle chuckle or a moment of shared joy. It was loud, deliberate, the kind of laugh designed to make sure everyone at the table heard it. We were sitting in our parents' dining room on a Sunday evening in October, the usual family gathering that happened every few weeks. I'd just mentioned that I was working on starting a nonprofit focused on literacy programs for underserved communities. I'd been planning it for months, researching funding models, building partnerships with local schools. I was excited, maybe too excited, because I'd let my guard down enough to share it with everyone. "Still chasing nothing?" he said, wiping tears from his eyes like my dreams were the funniest joke he'd heard all year. His name was Caleb, my older brother by 3 years, and he'd perfected the art of cutting me down in front of our family. Everyone watched me swallow it. My mother paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. My father looked down at his plate. My younger sister shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Nobody said a word in my defense. They just watched as I sat there, feeling my face burn with humiliation, feeling the familiar sting of being dismissed by the person who was supposed to be on my side. I forced a smile and said nothing, because what could I say that wouldn't make it worse? The table felt smaller. Not physically, but emotionally. The same dining table where we'd shared countless meals suddenly felt like a cage, trapping me in this moment of public humiliation. The air grew thick with uncomfortable silence. My mother tried to change the subject, asking about dessert, her voice overly cheerful in that way that meant she was trying to smooth things over without actually addressing what had just happened. My father made a comment about the weather. My sister excused herself to check on something in the kitchen. And Caleb sat there, satisfied, probably thinking he'd done me a favor by bringing me back to what he called reality. This was our pattern, replayed over and over for the past 5 years. I'd share something I was working toward, something I cared about, and he'd mock it publicly. Artistic pursuits were hobbies for people who can't handle real jobs. My master's degree in education was a waste of money for a field that pays nothing. My volunteer work was charity for people who can't compete in the actual economy. Every dream I voiced became ammunition for his superiority complex. And every time, our family watched in silence, unwilling to challenge him or defend me. He raised his glass. "To realism," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked around the table, waiting for someone to join his toast. My father, ever the peacekeeper who kept peace by avoiding conflict, lifted his glass slightly. My mother followed with a weak smile. I kept my hands in my lap, my own glass untouched. Caleb's idea of realism was simple. Success meant a high salary, a prestigious title, and the ability to talk loudly about both. He worked in finance, made good money, and never let anyone forget it. His car was expensive. His apartment was in the right neighborhood. His watch cost more than my monthly rent. These were his measures of worth, his proof that he'd figured out how life worked while the rest of us fumbled in the dark. "Someone has to keep this family grounded," he added, looking directly at me. "Can't all be dreamers floating around without a plan." The implication was clear. He was the successful one, the practical one, the one who understood how the world really worked. And I was the failure, the idealist, the one who'd never amount to anything because I insisted on pursuing work that mattered to me instead of work that paid the most. My name is Naomi. I'm 28 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life being treated like my brother's disappointing opposite. Where he chose finance, I chose education. Where he measured success in salary, I measured it in impact. Where he built a career designed to impress others, I built one designed to help them. For years, Caleb had positioned himself as the authority on success, and our family had largely accepted his narrative. He was the golden child, the one who'd made it, while I was the struggling dreamer who'd chosen the wrong path. And I learned silence isn't weakness. That realization came slowly, built from 100 moments like that dinner. For a long time, I tried to defend myself, to explain why my work mattered even if it didn't pay 6 figures. But defending yourself to someone determined to misunderstand you is exhausting. So I'd stopped. I'd learned that silence could be strategic, that not engaging with his mockery was more powerful than arguing against it. I'd learned to let him talk while I kept building, quietly, without his approval or understanding. My silence didn't mean I agreed with him. It meant I no longer needed him to understand what I was doing or why it mattered. He measured worth in money and noise. Caleb's entire identity was built on external validation. His salary, his job title, his expensive possessions, the impressed reactions he got when he talked about his work. These were the metrics that mattered to him. The scoreboard by which he judged not just himself but everyone around him. At every family gathering, he'd steer conversations toward his latest achievement, his recent bonus, his promotion, the exclusive restaurant he'd tried. The subtext was always the same. Look at me, see how successful I am, recognize that I've won at life. He needed everyone to know he was doing well, needed the recognition and envy. Success wasn't real to him unless other people witnessed it and acknowledged it. He measured my worth by those same metrics and found me lacking. My teacher's salary was barely enough to survive on. My small apartment was what people settle for when they can't afford better. My old car was embarrassing. He couldn't understand why I'd chosen work that fulfilled me over work that paid me, why I'd prioritized making a difference over making money. In his worldview, I'd failed at life by choosing meaning over wealth. I measured progress in quiet wins. While Caleb collected expensive things and loud accolades, I collected moments that mattered. A student who'd struggled with reading all year finally finishing their first chapter book, their face glowing with pride. A parent thanking me for not giving up on their child when other teachers had. A literacy program I'd developed being adopted by 3 more schools in the district. These were my measures of success, and they happened quietly, without fanfare or social media posts. I tracked progress differently than my brother. Not in salary increases, but in students who grew to love learning. Not in job titles, but in programs that worked. Not in possessions, but in relationships built with families and communities. My wins didn't make for good dinner conversation, at least not the kind Caleb valued. There were no impressive numbers to quote, no luxury brands to name drop. Just slow, steady growth in work that mattered to people who needed it. I knew my approach was building something real, even if it didn't look impressive from the outside. Even if my own brother couldn't see the value in what I was doing. I was creating change that would last long after his latest bonus was spent. He mocked my plans. Every single one of them. When I told the family I was going back to school for my master's in education, Caleb laughed and asked if I enjoyed being in debt for a degree that wouldn't increase my earning potential. When I mentioned I was developing a summer reading program for kids in low-income neighborhoods, he asked when I'd stop playing volunteer and get a real job. When I shared that I was being considered for a district curriculum coordinator position, he said it sounded like a fancy title for the same underpaid work. His mockery was consistent and public. He'd wait until we were all together, until there was an audience, before making his cutting comments. It wasn't enough to doubt me privately. He needed witnesses to my perceived failures. I think he genuinely believed he was helping me, that his harsh realism would eventually wake me up to what he saw as my wasted potential, that I'd suddenly realize he was right, abandon my foolish dreams of meaningful work, and join him in the pursuit of money and status. But his mockery had the opposite effect. Every time he dismissed what I was building, I became more certain I was on the right path. His values and mine were so fundamentally different that his disapproval became a kind of validation. I stopped explaining. There was a specific moment when I realized that defending my choices to Caleb was pointless. We were at a coffee shop, just the 2 of us, and I'd made the mistake of telling him about the nonprofit I was planning to start. I explained the mission, the need, the model I'd developed. I showed him my research, my partnerships, my funding strategy. I wanted him to understand, maybe even to support me for once. He listened with a smirk, then asked how I planned to pay my rent while I played charity. That's when I understood. It didn't matter how thorough my planning was, how solid my strategy, how clear my vision. He would never see value in work that prioritized impact over income. His worldview couldn't accommodate the idea that success might look different for different people. So I stopped explaining myself to him. Stopped sharing my plans, my progress, my wins. When he asked what I was up to, I gave vague answers. When he made his usual comments about my choices, I smiled and changed the subject. I realized I didn't owe him an explanation for my life, and giving him one only provided ammunition for future mockery. My work would speak for itself, eventually. I just needed to stay focused and let time do the talking. Years passed. 3 of them, to be exact. 3 years during which I stopped engaging with Caleb's narrative about my life and focused entirely on building what I believed in. I launched the nonprofit, secured funding from 3 local foundations, and hired a small team. We developed literacy programs that were implemented in 15 schools. I finished my master's degree and was promoted to a district-level position coordinating curriculum development. I published 2 articles in education journals about innovative approaches to reading instruction. I built relationships with community leaders, school administrators, and families who benefited from our programs. All of it happened quietly, without family fanfare or Caleb's knowledge. I stopped attending every family dinner, limiting my visits to holidays when I couldn't avoid them. When I did see him, I shared nothing about my work. The less he knew, the less material he had for his mockery. During those 3 years, something fundamental shifted. I stopped measuring my success by his standards or waiting for his approval. I stopped letting his opinion of me shape my own self-worth. I built a life and career that made sense to me, regardless of whether he understood or valued it. And I learned to be patient. Time, I realized, would eventually show the truth of what I'd been building. My life filled out slowly. Not with the loud, showy markers of success that Caleb valued, but with substance. I bought a small house in a neighborhood I loved, not fancy but mine. I built a community of colleagues and friends who understood the value of the work we were doing. I traveled, not to expensive resorts but to education conferences where I learned and shared ideas. I saved money, not massive amounts but enough to feel secure. I dated, fell in love, ended up in a relationship with someone who appreciated my values instead of questioning them. My calendar filled with meaningful commitments. Board meetings for the nonprofit, curriculum reviews with teachers, literacy nights with families, coffee dates with friends who inspired me. My bookshelf filled with professional development materials, student thank you notes, and research that excited me. My life wasn't Instagram perfect or impressive by conventional standards, but it was deeply, genuinely mine. It fit me in a way that Caleb's life, for all its expensive polish, never seemed to fit him. I noticed that in my quieter moments. When I saw him at family gatherings, he'd talk endlessly about his achievements, but there was an emptiness underneath. A need to convince everyone, maybe even himself, that he was as successful as he claimed. It stayed loud and hollow. While my life was quietly filling with purpose and connection, Caleb seemed to be growing louder but emptier. He changed jobs twice in those 3 years, each time chasing a bigger salary and more impressive title. He bought a new car, then another. He dated a series of women he described in terms of their looks and status rather than their personalities. He posted constantly on social media about his accomplishments, his possessions, his lifestyle. But when you looked closely, when you listened past the noise, something was missing. He had colleagues but few real friends. He had dates but no lasting relationships. He had impressive career moves but no clear sense of why he was making them beyond money and status. At family gatherings, he'd dominate conversations with stories about his latest achievements, but the stories all sounded the same. Different details, same emptiness. He'd upgraded from a BMW to a Mercedes, but what did it mean? He'd gotten another promotion, but to what end? The more he talked, the more I noticed the hollowness underneath. He needed constant validation, constant proof that his life choices were correct, constant reassurance that he'd won at life. It reminded me of someone shouting to convince themselves they weren't lost. Meanwhile, I'd stopped shouting entirely. He asked questions he never listened to. During this period, Caleb developed a strange habit. He'd ask me about my work, but in a way that made it clear he wasn't actually interested in the answer. So still teaching? He'd say, knowing I'd moved into curriculum development and nonprofit leadership. Making any real money yet? He'd ask, already knowing he wouldn't consider my salary real, regardless of what it was. Still doing that volunteer thing? He'd question, deliberately diminishing the nonprofit I'd built into something trivial. The questions were rhetorical, setups for his own commentary. I'd start to answer, and he'd interrupt with his own opinions about what I should be doing instead. He'd offer unsolicited advice about career moves I should make, connections I should pursue, ways I could finally start building real wealth. He asked questions not to learn or connect, but to create opportunities to assert his worldview, to remind me and everyone else that he knew better. It was exhausting and transparent. Each question was a tiny performance of superiority, a little show for whoever was listening. I learned to recognize the pattern, and adjusted my responses accordingly. I answered less. My responses to Caleb's questions became shorter and vaguer. "Things are good" became my standard reply. When he pushed for details, I'd smile and say same old, even though my life was actually evolving in significant ways. I starved his need for information, refusing to give him material he could mock or minimize. If he asked about work, I'd deflect to questions about his job. If he pushed about my nonprofit, I'd change the subject to our parents or our sister. I mastered the art of the non-answer, the pleasant deflection, the conversational pivot. It drove him crazy, I could tell. He was used to me defending myself, explaining, trying to make him understand. My new approach of minimal engagement frustrated him, because it removed his platform. He couldn't mock what I didn't share. He couldn't dismiss what I didn't explain. Our interactions became shorter, less frequent. When we did talk, I kept things surface level and polite. I'd learned that silence and brevity were more powerful than any argument I could make. Let him think what he wanted. I didn't need to correct his misconceptions. The truth would become apparent eventually, without my help. News reached him before I did. That's how I knew things were really changing. In the 4th year after that painful dinner, my nonprofit won a significant grant from a national foundation. The award came with recognition in education circles, some press coverage, and invitations to speak at conferences. I didn't tell my family about it immediately. I saw no reason to. The recognition was satisfying, but I didn't need to parade it in front of Caleb. Then my mother called one evening, her voice excited. "Why didn't you tell us about the award? Mrs. Henderson saw an article about your nonprofit in the City magazine. She showed it to me at church. Naomi, this is incredible." I'd forgotten that news travels in unexpected ways. Mrs. Henderson, our family friend, had a daughter who worked in education and followed sector news. The article had reached my family through someone else's discovery, which felt appropriate somehow. My mother wanted all the details. How much was the grant? What would we do with it? Why hadn't I mentioned it? I explained briefly, downplaying it the way I'd learned to downplay everything. But I could hear in her voice that she was telling my father, probably forwarding the article, which meant Caleb would see it soon. I wondered how he'd respond. His tone changed. The next time I saw Caleb at a family birthday dinner for our father, he was different. Not humble exactly, but less aggressive. He asked about the nonprofit grant, but without his usual dismissive edge. "I saw the article about your organization," he said, his voice careful, almost tentative. "Sounds like you're doing well." It wasn't an apology or an admission that he'd been wrong, just an acknowledgement that something he couldn't ignore had happened. I thanked him briefly and changed the subject, but I noticed the shift. He didn't mock my work that evening. He didn't make jokes about my choices. He actually seemed uncertain about how to interact with me now that my success was becoming visible to others. Over the following months, his tone continued to change. The condescension faded. The mockery stopped. When we talked, he was almost respectful, though there was an awkwardness to it, like he wasn't sure what our relationship was supposed to be now that his narrative about my failure had been disproven. I didn't rush to make him comfortable. I maintained the same polite distance I'd established, answering his questions briefly, sharing little. The shift in power dynamics was subtle but real. I no longer felt smaller around him. He asked for introductions. 6 months after the grant award, something remarkable happened. Caleb called me directly, not texting through the family group chat, but actually calling. "Hey, I know we don't talk much about work stuff, but I'm looking at some investment opportunities in the education sector. Would you be willing to introduce me to some of the foundation people you work with?" I was so surprised I almost laughed. This was the same person who'd spent years telling me my work in education was a waste of time, that the sector had no real money, that I was foolish for choosing impact over income. Now he wanted my connections. He wanted access to the network I'd built in a field he'd dismissed as worthless. I told him I'd think about it and get back to him. Then I sat with the request for a few days, trying to understand what it meant. Was this an acknowledgement that he'd been wrong? A recognition that my work had value? Or just opportunism? Seeing a chance to make money and not caring about the contradiction with his previous position? I decided it didn't matter. I wasn't interested in helping him profit from relationships I'd built through years of genuine commitment to the work. I called him back and politely declined, saying I didn't feel comfortable mixing his financial interests with my professional relationships. I waited. That was my strategy during this period. I didn't confront Caleb about his years of mockery. I didn't demand an apology or acknowledgement. I just waited and watched as the evidence of my success accumulated in ways he couldn't dismiss. My nonprofit expanded to serve 30 schools. I was promoted to a director-level position in the school district. I was invited to present at a national education conference. A local news station featured our literacy program. Each development was something I shared with my parents, knowing it would reach Caleb eventually. And I watched his response change. The mockery transformed into silence. The dismissiveness became awkward respect. The loud opinions about my poor choices faded into uncomfortable quiet. I waited because I understood something important. Time was doing the work I'd once tried to do through argument and explanation. Every month that passed, every achievement that accumulated, every piece of recognition that came, spoke louder than anything I could say. His narrative about my failure was crumbling under the weight of reality. I didn't need to tear it down. It was collapsing on its own. I just needed to keep doing the work and let the results speak for themselves. Time did the work for me. That was the lesson I'd learned through all of this. For years, I tried to make Caleb understand the value of what I was building. I'd explained my choices, defended my path, argued for the legitimacy of my work. It had been exhausting and ineffective. But when I stopped trying to convince him and simply focused on the work itself, time became my advocate. Each year that passed added more evidence. Each project I completed demonstrated competence. Each recognition showed that others valued what I was doing. I didn't need to convince Caleb anymore, because the results convinced him for me. The quiet accumulation of success over time was more powerful than any argument I could have made in the moment. This realization changed how I approached conflict and doubt in general. When someone dismisses your path or doubts your choices, you don't owe them an immediate response. You can simply do the work and let time reveal the truth. That's not avoidance or weakness. It's patience and strategic thinking. It's understanding that some arguments can't be won with words, but only with sustained action and eventual outcomes. Caleb's opinion of me had shifted not because I'd convinced him, but because reality had. He apologized awkwardly. It happened at a family Christmas gathering, 7 years after that initial dinner, when he'd laughed at my nonprofit plans. We were in the kitchen together, alone for a moment while others were in the living room. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I owe you an apology," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I was wrong about your work. About your choices. I didn't understand what you were building." The words came out stiff and formal, like he'd rehearsed them but couldn't quite deliver them naturally. I waited for him to continue. "I thought success looked one way. I thought if you weren't chasing money, you were failing. But watching what you've built, the impact you've had, I realize I was narrow-minded. I'm sorry for the things I said. For not supporting you." It was the apology I might have desperately wanted 7 years earlier. But standing there now, listening to his uncomfortable words, I felt surprisingly little. Not triumph, not vindication, just a kind of calm neutrality. Too much time had passed. Too much distance had grown between us. I'd built a life and career I was proud of, and his opinion no longer held the power it once had. His apology didn't change the past or heal the hurt of those years. I accepted without warmth. "I appreciate you saying that," I told him, my voice polite but distant. "I didn't say it's okay, because it wasn't completely okay. Years of mockery and dismissal don't disappear with a single apology. I didn't pretend that his acknowledgement suddenly made us close again, or erase the hurt he'd caused. I simply accepted his apology the way you might accept a statement of fact, acknowledging it without letting it deeply affect you. He seemed to want more, some warmth or forgiveness that would ease his discomfort, but I didn't offer it. Our relationship wasn't going to be magically repaired because he'd finally admitted what I'd known all along. Too much had happened. Too much time had passed with him as my critic rather than my supporter. The truth was I'd stopped needing his approval years ago. I'd built a support system of colleagues, friends, and mentors who understood and valued my work. I had relationships built on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. His belated recognition of my success didn't fill any void, because I'd already filled that void with people who'd believed in me from the start. I was cordial but not warm. Civil but not close. That was all I had to offer. He stopped laughing. The most noticeable change in Caleb after his apology was what he stopped doing. He stopped laughing at my choices. He stopped making jokes about my salary or my nonprofit. He stopped the running commentary about how I'd be better off in business or finance. He stopped positioning himself as the authority on success and me as the cautionary tale. Family gatherings became quieter in a way. Without Caleb's constant need to assert his superiority, conversations felt more balanced. He talked less about his own achievements, maybe because he was starting to question whether the metrics he'd been using actually mattered. Or maybe because he realized that loud declarations of success suggested insecurity, rather than confidence. The dynamic between us shifted into something I'd call polite distance. We were civil when we saw each other. We made small talk about safe topics. But we didn't have real conversations, didn't share genuine updates about our lives, didn't seek each other's advice or support. We were siblings by blood but strangers by choice, or perhaps by the accumulated weight of years spent in opposition. And I was okay with that. Not every relationship can or should be repaired. Sometimes the best outcome is peaceful coexistence without closeness. Silence shifted sides. This was the most striking change of all. For years, silence at family gatherings had been my burden to bear. When Caleb mocked me, I stayed silent. When he dismissed my work, I swallowed my response. When he asserted his superiority, I kept my counter-arguments to myself. The silence had been mine, and it had felt like weakness, like surrender. But now, the silence had moved. Now when someone mentioned my work, Caleb went quiet. When my achievements came up in conversation, he had nothing to say. When family members asked about my latest project or recognition, he sat there silently, no longer the loud authority on everything. The silence that had once been my defensive strategy had become his position of irrelevance. He had nothing to add because he'd been so completely wrong about me that speaking up would only remind everyone of his past misjudgment. The shift was subtle but profound. I no longer needed to be silent to protect myself. And he needed to be silent to avoid exposing his own blind spots. It was a reversal I'd never consciously pursued, but found deeply satisfying nonetheless. The silence had switched sides, and with it, the power dynamic had fundamentally changed. He realized I'd surpassed him quietly. This understanding seemed to dawn on Caleb gradually over the following year. Not in income, he still made more money than I did, but in ways that actually mattered. In impact and influence. In community respect. In work satisfaction. In relationships and support networks. In the kind of success that brought genuine fulfillment rather than empty validation. My nonprofit had grown to serve 50 schools, and was being studied as a model by other organizations. I'd been appointed to a state education advisory board. I'd co-authored a book about innovative literacy approaches. I had a waiting list of schools wanting to implement our programs. Meanwhile, his job had grown increasingly unstable. His company had gone through layoffs. His relationship with his long-term girlfriend had ended badly. His social media posts, once constant, had become sporadic. The loud certainty that had defined him was fading. I think he finally understood that while he'd been busy collecting symbols of success, I'd been building actual success. The kind that didn't require constant validation or announcement. The kind that existed whether or not anyone was watching. He'd surpassed me in salary. I'd surpassed him in meaning. And quietly, without declaring it, we both knew which type of success was more lasting. I no longer needed his approval. That was perhaps the most important realization of all. There was a time when Caleb's opinion of me had mattered deeply, when his mockery had genuinely hurt, when his dismissal of my choices had made me question myself. But somewhere in the years of building my work and my life, his approval had stopped being something I needed or even wanted. I'd found validation in my own accomplishments, in the communities I served, in the colleagues who respected my work, in the students whose lives were changed by our programs. His opinion, once so central to how I felt about myself, had become irrelevant. Not through anger or spite, but through genuine indifference. I'd outgrown the need for his approval the way you outgrow clothes that no longer fit. Looking back, I could see that his constant criticism had actually been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to develop internal validation, to learn to trust my own judgment, to build confidence that didn't depend on external approval. If he'd been supportive from the start, I might have remained dependent on his opinion. Instead, his doubt had pushed me to become self-reliant in ways I might not have otherwise developed. I was grateful for that, in a strange way. Not for the hurt, but for the strength I'd been forced to build because of it. He called me a failure for years. Time answered him better than I ever could. That became my final understanding of the entire experience. For 7 years, Caleb had positioned me as the failure in our sibling relationship. The one who'd made poor choices, pursued the wrong path, valued the wrong things. And for 7 years, I'd let time accumulate the evidence that proved him wrong. I'd let my work speak instead of defending it with words. I'd let results accumulate instead of arguing about potential. I'd let recognition come instead of demanding acknowledgement. Time had been my ally in a way I couldn't have orchestrated consciously. Each year added layers of proof that my path, while different from his, was valuable and successful. Each achievement demonstrated that impact and income weren't mutually exclusive, that meaningful work could also be recognized and respected. Each piece of recognition showed that success had multiple definitions, and his narrow view had missed entire dimensions of what achievement could look like. In the end, I didn't need to prove anything to him. Time did that for me. And the answer time provided was louder and clearer than any argument I could have made. I wasn't a failure. I was someone who'd chosen differently, built patiently, and succeeded quietly. And that, it turned out, was the most powerful response of all.